Now, the reason I'm here is I have written a book. I know you didn't even know that, did you? Some people ask me, why write a book? Well, first of all, I have to tell you, I wrote it in part out of guilt. Good old-fashioned guilt. My grandmother was after me to write a book from the time I was in my 30s, 40s, something like that. When I was much younger, let's put it that way. And she kept saying, you've got to write a book, you've got to write a book. And I would say, Grandma, nobody wants to read about me. Nobody wants to know my story. Well, then, eventually, my grandmother died, and I had not written the book. But in some sort of show of something, I don't know, ego, I think, on the day of her funeral, I stood up in front of the gathered family and friends and announced that I was going to write a book in fulfillment of the request of my grandmother. My grandmother died in 2000. My grandmother died almost 13 years ago, and it took me, well, you know, let's be honest. I made that grand proclamation, and someone could have sprung up and easily said, liar, liar, pants on fire. Because honestly, the thought of writing it just about propelled me into the grave with her. It was terrifying. And yet, life does what life does, and most especially God's Spirit does what it does. And it was many years later. It began in a little guest house behind a bigger house with friends. And I started writing the story. And 5 years later, here it is. The book is titled Grace Rolls On. Any of you ever had a difficult time naming your children? Anybody ever take pause in deciding what to name your children for fear that one day they will go to school and kids will go or make fun or do this or do that? I have a friend named Rick Richards. And I think, what were they thinking? Richard Richards? You know, it's just different. With a book, it not only follows a child everywhere, it goes to the Library of Congress. And so I wrestled with what to call the book. The book finally was a variety of titles, most of them including the word gimpy, which I love a lot. But my editors would just quiver when they read it. They would just, we don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. You really don't want to do that. I even had an editor, at one point, my initial editor, had a child that was disabled. And it was very hard for her to read my book because I take it a little lightly. And she didn't like that. But ultimately, I had this phrase that I always sign at the end of my emails. My editor says, what is this grace rolls on thing? And I said, well, it's just my feeling that God's grace, the proclaiming of it, just continues to roll on, despite our personal circumstances, where we are, where we find ourselves. I said, as a matter of fact, I'll tell you the story of where that came from. It came from the patio out there. On a night when friends and family gathered to give the gift to me of that chair and help me get started on that van. It was a time in my life when the leg was not an option and I needed to be in a wheelchair. And it just wasn't in the budget, shall we say. And people from this place said, oh no, we will make this happen. And there was an event called Sweet Grace out on the patio, and people came and loved and supported and created this wonderful thing for me. And when I was called upon to make the Miss America acceptance speech, I said, I promise you with this chair, my work as God has called me to proclaim the gospel of grace will roll on. Grace always rolls on. So at the end of it, there's this telling this story, there's this silence on the phone. And the first thing I hear is, and Lily says, that's my publisher, Lily says, I think we've titled your book, Grace Rolls On. So that's the title, that's where it came from. Writing a book is no easy task. Those of you that are in the process of doing it, praise you. Those of you who read books, God love you for reading this. I want to tell you that there are stories in here that some of you have heard before. There are stories of how I was diagnosed and how I grew up. Maybe there's more in here than you ever heard before. One fellow in my Tuesday morning adult study said to me, "You don't have a problem with oversharing, do you?" I said, "Well, maybe. Is that a problem?" He said, "Well, there were a couple of graphic scenes that I just wasn't really sure I was ready for." But so tread lightly if you're going to read the book. But there are stories that I hope make you laugh. And there are stories that I hope make you think. And there are stories that I hope inspire you and call upon that part of you that might sometimes say, "I don't think I can." Oh, yes, I can. I'm not sure if it's right, but by the grace of God, it'll be all right. I hope there are stories in there that allow you, with the questions I put at the end of each chapter, to reflect on your own faith journey. There are stories that are missing in the book. I've already gotten feedback from people who've read it about the missing stories. So I'm going to share two of them. One's a short one, one's a little bit longer, so hang on, all right? So don't give me anything that you've heard a story and it's not in the book. All right, here are the couple of stories. And I'm sure I've missed others, but two stories. When my dad was alive, his passion in life was sports of all kinds and sorts, but particularly baseball, football, and golf. And one of my earliest memories is of my dad taking me to the Tucson Open golf tournament. I was in a wheelchair. And he would roll, along the bumpy roads and set me up by the green to watch them play. Now, I was a daddy's girl, so I also love sports. And when Daddy said we were going to go to the golf tournament, well, that was great. I knew all of those players that would be there, and particularly my favorite golfer in the entire world, Gary Player. Oh, I could hardly wait to see Gary Player. So here we go to the Open, and we watch Billy Casper, and at the end of his round, he signs a ball and tosses it to my dad. And there were others, 2 or 3 others, that signed balls and tossed them to my dad. But at the end of Gary Player's round, actually I think it was more like the 17th hole, when Gary was finished at 17, Rabbit, who was his longtime caddy, Rabbit Kinkai. Rabbit brings over a ball signed by Gary Player and is wiping tears out of his eyes as he walks away. I had no idea what had upset him. But turns out there was something about seeing a little girl in a wheelchair at a golf tournament that seemed to make somebody happy. So we immediately worked our way to get to 18 in hopes I'd get close enough to meet Gary Player. And sure enough, I did. As he came off 18, Rabbit pointed for us to meet them over by the other path. And we moved, and I got to shake Gary Player's hand. I was flying. Now, the rest of the kids my age back then probably wanted to be able to, shake one of the Beatles' hands, but I wanted to shake Gary Player's hand. And so I did. I then, in the ensuing years, would actually write him letters and occasionally got letters back, wishing him good luck in the Masters, wishing him, well, this and that. I had signed autographs. I was kind of a little Gary Player groupie. Well, fast forward probably 30 plus years. Gary Player is playing in a senior tournament in the very early days of the senior PGA Tour, playing in a tournament out in Sun City. And I said to my mom, I gotta go see Gary Player. So I went. I went out and I waited at 18 to see him finish. And when he was finished, there was just something in me, even though I can hear my father say, don't be a stalker. When they're off, finished, let them go. And so here I go and put myself near Gary Player, who looks up, makes eye contact with me, and walks over to me. And I said, Mr. Player, my name is Paula Sturgeon, and I was a fan of yours from the time I was a child. And he says, and yes, you're walking. He remembered me in a chair. And he got tears in his eyes, and he thanked me for coming to greet him. I think of my dad among the saints in light and how he must have giggled at me not doing what he said, and I got to see Gary Player. The other story I will tell you revolves around where I chose to end the book. When you're writing a memoir, every new day could be a new chapter. And at some point, you just have to say, enough, stop. So I stopped at what seemed to be a logical stopping place, my amputation. We make the cut, we go on. So I stopped the story at the amputation, and you'll get to read all about that, right? Just nod. Mm-hmm. Thank you. But the story that's not in there happened 2 years later. Because 2 years later, what happened to me is what happens to most people who have an amputation. You have to have the knee replaced on the other side because you wear it out. So, knee replacement surgery. I had knee replacements on the one that was gone over and over again. But it was much harder to recover that time. There's something about aging that makes it more difficult to bounce back. I don't quite understand it. And I said to the doctor, this is much more painful than I remember them. And he says, you're much older, too. But after we got finished with a little slapping each other back and forth, I knew that when I was finished, it was very difficult for my mom to care for me in the immediate post-op days. So I very grudgingly agreed to go to rehab. Now, if any of you have ever heard the Amy Winehouse song, I don't want to go to rehab, that was me. I was singing it even though I was going, yeah, I'll go. And I'm going, I don't want to go to rehab. Because for me, rehab seemed like a nursing home, which seemed like the end of the trail for an old cripple. Really did. But here's how it happened. It happens that they transfer you to rehab at any time of the day or night. They do not particularly care whether it's morning, noon, or the cover of darkness, like it was for me. At 7 o'clock, a guy comes in with what he said was a gurney, but it was the shakiest, most broken down thing I'd ever seen, hoisted me onto it and said, we're going to rehab. And I said, oh, okay, I guess we're going now. And we got to the rehab hospital. They get you into your room at night, and the rehab nurse comes in, the RN that was taking care of me, and says, do you want pain medicine? I said, after that ride, load me up, baby. Load me up. And so I had a fairly restful night's sleep, and then that morning, an aide comes into the room and says, well, aren't you going to breakfast? I said, breakfast? I don't know. I have not been to orientation. I do not know what the rules are. You can just go ahead and bring a tray. And she said, we don't bring no stinking trays. You get up, you go to the dining room, you will be all right. I said, okay, I don't have clothes, it's okay. She says, it's okay, put your robe on. And all of a sudden, here comes a wheelchair. It even has my name on it, because you have your own wheelchair when you're at rehab, let me just tell you. Mine was actually pretty cool as I think about it now. They load me in, they take me to the dining room, and it is absolutely my worst nightmare. And all seriousness aside, there were people spitting, people drooling, people not knowing who they were or where they were, and then there was me. And I thought, like, oh my God, I have landed in an alien land. Just get me through. And the line, you're supposed to roll up, tell them your room number, order what you want to order, and then somebody will roll you to the table. I knew none of how to do that. I had to learn quickly. I got parked at my table, and I just was devastated. This was my worst nightmare. I finish with my breakfast. I go park in the hallway, which is what you're supposed to do, so that anybody walking by with a free set of hands rolls you back to your room. I got back to my room and promptly decided I'll pass on lunch. Well, you know what happens when you pass on food at rehab? They send in the shrink. You don't want to eat? Must be a problem. Maybe she took one look at me and thought, oh God, if she didn't want to eat, there must be serious issues here. And I thought, and she sits there and says, are you having problems adapting? And I'm saying, really? Finally, I tried to say, I know what I'm doing, I just am not hungry. She didn't buy it, but she did get out of the room. Well, then came dinner time. Fortunately, my mother brought dinner, but I still had to go down there and check in so that I didn't have a shrink visit the next morning. Well, by the next morning, I knew the drill. I knew room number, order, drink order, seat. And I thought, I'm getting up early. I'm getting the seat I want. I'm not having to sit next to the spitters. And so I'm getting there early. And I got there early when the oatmeal was still something that vaguely approached oatmeal. And got my food and sat down and watched them pile in. Well, along comes an older lady. I might classify her as a drooler. She was kind of slunked over in her chair. She didn't want to be there either. She didn't want to give them her room number, but she did. And they kept telling her, low sodium, and she says, give me bacon, no, low sodium. But then she gets to the end of the line where you place your drink order, and she says, I'll have scotch. And I lifted my hand to Maria and I said, bring her over here. Because anybody with that kind of sense of humor was going to save me from the rest of things. They rolled her over next to me, and I said, I think they didn't give you scotch because I got the last of it. And you know what? In that moment, she and I bonded and became rehab buddies. This snarky, unhappy lady's real name, right hand to God, was Mrs. Sunshine. Mrs. Sunshine was not happy to be at rehab, was not happy with the food, was not happy with her lack of cocktail hour. She wasn't happy with much of anything. Pretty soon we were joined by another woman whose name escapes me because it's just not nearly as funny as Mrs. Sunshine's. But what I do remember from her is that she had a son. He's a priest in Baltimore, a Greek priest in Baltimore. Did I tell you about my son who's in Baltimore? He's a priest. And I'd say, every day I'd say to her, so do you have a son? And she'd say, yes, I have a son. He's a priest. He's in Baltimore. I said, a priest? She says, yes, in Baltimore. And it would go on, and Sunshine roll her eyes like, oh, she's playing her game. And between the mother of the priest in Baltimore and Mrs. Sunshine, The fear and loathing of being in rehab was replaced by a genuine sense of purpose. I was there to listen to them. I was there to be that non-drooling, non-spitting presence. And on my last day in rehab, Sunshine and I shared a mat. The big mats that you do rehab on are about like a queen-size bed. So you're on one side and the person's on the other. So the torturer's on either side. And she had had a stroke and they were trying to stretch her. And when you have a knee replacement, they're trying to stretch you. And she's patting on the mat because it's hurting. You know, said you can only pat out in wrestling, Sunshine. This is rehab. And she's patting down, and I put my hand on hers, and she held onto it so tightly I thought she was going to rip my hand off. But God put me in rehab to hold her hand. God put her there to help me get past what was so hard. And you know, it's really interesting to me, my friends, how often we are upset about the situation in our lives. And yet, there are people and items and circumstances all around us who need us just as much as we need them. It was good for me, it was good for Sunshine, it was good for the mother of Priest. I think he was in Baltimore, I don't remember. At the end of the day, I even got to work out next to Muhammad Ali, who was doing some rehab there. I got to be in a gym with the greatest. He doesn't float like a butterfly, but he still looks strong enough to sting like a bee. I wouldn't want to get in front of the right cross. And so, at the end of the day, rehab turned out to be a gift to me, not a burden. Little closing tag to the story. I had Mother bring me a little bottle of scotch. And the church had sent the altar flowers, which also always makes your rehab room look like a mortuary, because it's this kind of altar spray. But they were beautiful. So I took the scotch, stuck it in the flowers, and sent it to Sunshine. I told the nurse, there's a little nip in there for Sunshine. It better get to Sunshine. She said, trust me, there'll be nights we'll want to open it and shove it down her throat. And I said, you know, she's just a toughie, I know, but she was a gift to me. Sunshine was an angel in my life. So I write a book about the times that were tough and the times in which light and life shines through. I write a book about the people who have been in my life, who have formed the person that I am. You know who they are. Look around. You are part of it. You are part of what made that book happen. This community was the first place that I was allowed to exercise the gifts I feel God has given me. Where I got to preach, where I got to teach. A ragtag group of women called Tuesdays at 10. Why did we name it Tuesdays at 10, Janice? So we could always remember where we need to be. Because we knew the day would come. It's Tuesday, it's 10. I know there's something I'm supposed to be doing. And teach kids and teach adults. So I give thanks for all of you. For all of you are a part of the story. And for you, I will always be grateful. So the story goes on. Grace rolls on. I will continue to be out in the world preaching and teaching. For those of you who are wintering here, I love a summer visit to the Midwest. Give me a call. I will pile in the car and head your way. But let me just close with a giant word of thanks for inviting me, for loving me, for supporting me, and for being the people of God that keep us all going. Thanks be to God for all of you. Amen.